Okay, I've just quickly reset part 5 back to its original state. So we've just got a single instance of the indirect active1 subrequesting accessor, and I've taken out that example of active1 that I put in there in the previous section. And we'll see why I've returned that to its original state in a moment. If we look at the part 6 address space, what we'll see is our old favorite, the active1 endpoint is implemented here, and in addition what we've got is an import, and we're importing the part 5 address space. So we're importing this indirect active1 endpoint. Let's have a look at the address space. So if we look at part 6 and we look at its diagram, what we can see is my part 6 address space has an instance of accessor 1, then it contains an import of the part 5 address space, which contains the subrequest accessor, which is the thing that can call active1 in its subrequest. So let's play with making some requests into this setup. Going back to the request trace tool, if I resolve indirect active1 in that space, then unsurprisingly I get a resolve to the subrequest accessor, and notice that because we've got an import relationship, the request started in this part 6 space. It didn't match on accessor 1, which is at the top of that space. It then found the import, which delegated the resolution down to the part 5 space, where the subrequest accessor says, yeah, I match indirect active1. So that endpoint is resolved in this address space. So now I'm going to use the visualizer so that we can actually request. Let's clear that and start the visualizer. So I'm going to make a request for indirect active1 in the part 6 space. Not really very surprising, it makes a sub request and finds active1. But how did it do that? Well, let's have a look at indirect active1 in the visualizer. And as before, what we find is the request was issued into the part 5 address space. So the request was resolved. Let's have a look at, first of all, at the details of how that came about. We find that the indirect active1 request was issued into the part 6 address space, but then it was resolved, and we see that it's got the same stack trace as we saw, resolution trace. We went from part 6 into the part 5 address space and found the subrequest accessor down there in that space, and we resolved that request. But then the subrequest accessor from the part 5 address space, notice here's the space where it's making its request, issued a new request for active:1. So let's have a look at that request. We see that the requester was the subrequest accessor, the identifier was active:1, and now notice that we have this thing called a request scope. So what we see is that the first space that we're issuing the request into is in part 5, and this is the space that contains the subrequest accessor declaration. But above us in the address space, or next down in the address space, is the part 6 address space. So what's happening here? What we find is that when the active1 request is issued by the subrequest accessor, the resolution first of all is attempted in the part 5 address space here, and the part 5 address space just contains the subrequest accessor. So the subrequest accessor says, no, I don't resolve, there's no match. But instead of giving up at that point, because we've got two parts to our address space, to our scope, the resolution says, well, I know of another space. I know of a space above me in the request stack. I'll go try there. So I'll descope to the part 6 address space, and I'll look in there. And so the resolution starts there, and we find that the first endpoint in there is accessor 1. And accessor 1 says, yeah, I resolve active column 1. And we find the execution happens, and we return the representation. So in our resolution process, what we've done is we started with a request at this space. The request was resolved through the import to this endpoint. The endpoint issued a sub-request at this point. The sub-request attempted to be resolved in this space. We reached the end of this space, but because the original request originated from another space above us, this resolution can pop the scope and return back to this space and say, do you know anything about active 1? At which point we hit the active 1 endpoint, which said, yes, I can resolve it. And what we're effectively doing is, as we go down in import, we build up a chain of request scope spaces above us. And every time we reach the end of a space in resolution, if we wish to, and we don't prevent it, we're able to recurse back up the stack and say, do you know about this resource? Do you know about this resource? And so we can contextually build up a set of relationships between where we request something and how that then allows the requested endpoint to access resources in the spaces that are on the way. And we'll see how that leads to some powerful patterns in a moment.